December in Paris, 195 countries came together and agreed on the first legally binding agreement to curb climate change. That was after decades of discussions. It was a truly landmark achievement. But today, the debate on climate change has barely moved on. There is still a large quorum of people who deny that climate change even exists. So do these climate deniers have a point? Are there arguments we should be taking seriously? Today, to discuss this, I'm talking with Bob Ayers, INSEAD Emeritus Professor of Political Science, Economics, and Technology. The most powerful argument they seem to be making these days is the fact that if you go back 18 years, global temperatures have not risen. The other thing climate deniers say is that this foremost scientific body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that they regularly get their forecasts wrong.
That's true. The earliest forecasts, going back to 1990, were considerably off. They were much too optimistic in terms of, or pessimistic, depending on your point of view. That is, they predicted the climate, that the average temperature would be rising faster than it actually did. And so the models themselves, I should say what they are. These are called general circulation models. They are models of the global atmosphere and its turbulent, complex motions that reflect the flows of both material flows of air and water and temperature variations over north to south, for example, and also from land to sea. Very complex set of things happening in the world. And because of this complexity, the models are created in terms of essentially little blocks of atmosphere. These blocks, I think, are about 100 kilometers diameter, radius, roughly. They may have gotten better since then, and that is certainly happening because as the data availability becomes more complete, the models can get more precise and more accurate. The models were 30 years ago fairly crude. The models have been improving because the data is getting much better. When those first models were created back in 1990, we had very little information about the temperature of the ocean. It was essentially based on whatever ships at sea were able to report in terms of their particular time and location. However, since then, a very large program has been implemented. The Argo program involves 4,000 things they call bathythermograph, which are, they take temperature at different levels, different depths of the sea, and they go down to 2,000 meters. So we now have reports through the weather service satellites from each of these bathythermographs on a regular basis. They report several times a month. Mm-hmm. Now this is still not continuous, but it's getting more continuous.
Don't they say, though, that there are still a lot of uncertainties about this model? I understand that, as you say, in the past 20 to 30 years, there's been significant progress made in these models. Sure. But there's still some very large uncertainties, for example, on cloud effects.
Yes.
So how can we really have, a high degree of confidence in these models if there's still these large uncertainties?
Well, I think the point I really need to make today is that, yes, you're right, there are still major uncertainties with respect to cloud effects. That's admitted. Nobody denies that. The models are also still based on much too large distances between points, data points. That will change. It is changing. It's getting better. But we don't really depend upon the models to make the point. And that is really the argument here.
Okay, so what's the most powerful evidence of climate change, models aside?
Briefly, sea level rise. Now, there are basically only three ways to explain why the sea level is rising. Only three. One of them is that the ocean water is expanding because it's warming. Turns out that water occupies a greater volume as it gets warmer. This has been known for hundreds of years. There's no mystery about it. It's why ice floats. It's one of the reasons. So we have thermal expansion. Second reason is more water. Water flowing into the sea from where? From the land. In particular, from the ice. The glacial ice, mainly the mountain ice, the Greenland ice, and the Antarctic ice. And there's a third possibility, which is interesting, and that is that the land itself is rising. That would make the sea level rise, if the land under the sea was rising. However, it's not. The land under the sea is not rising, it's actually going down. And the reason for it, it's understood. The reason for it is that 10,000 years ago, when the last ice ages ended, a large amount of water went into the sea, raising the sea level, and also it released the weight of that ice on the land where it had been. Now, there's a rebound going on. So the land under Scandinavia and northern Canada is actually rising. It rises at a very slow rate, but it is rising. It's like a spring recovering. And the magma under the main part of the ocean, under the crust, is flowing slowly, but still flowing into that vacated area that was formerly under pressure. So that's why the sea level, the land under the sea, is actually sinking slightly. This is all very small, but it's real. It's happening. That means that only thermal expansion and melting ice can account for the rising sea level, one or the other. It was estimated, 50 years ago, I guess, by people at Scripps Observatory in the Pacific, in Santa Barbara, I guess, that it was about half and half, that half of the sea level rise, it was already being measured for a long time. Half the sea level rise was due to thermal expansion and half due to ice melting. We have a more accurate measure now. It turns out that back then it was, I think, only 30% ice and 60% or 70% thermal. However, in the last 20 years, that has reversed. And now it's 70 to 80% from melting ice, only 20 or 30% from thermal expansion. Thermal expansion means there's heating. Melting ice means there's heating. And there's no other explanation of rising sea level. And for that, we don't need these accurate models of atmospheric events.
Okay. Well, the other main argument that climate change deniers make a lot about why climate change is so much on the agenda today is because it's a very easy way for politicians to gain support from their base. You know, for a Green Party, for example, it's a ploy on the part of big science to get grants from government to study climate change. It's an easy way for political leaders to burnish their credentials. Is there evidence of this?
I would say it's almost the reverse.
Well, first of all, is there any evidence?
First of all, what's big science? Since that's the last thing you mentioned, I don't know what big science is. Big science certainly isn't self-supporting with a lot of money to spend. Big science, maybe CERN, maybe those very expensive particle accelerators might be big science. They have nothing to do with this issue. I certainly don't see, and I don't think anybody could argue that the political leaders are getting a lot of public support by supporting climate change. It's almost clearly the opposite. In the United States, the whole Republican Party, every single member of the Republican Party, they're forced. Every member of the House of Representatives has to be a climate denier. Otherwise, it gets no support from the people who are paying for the elections and the Republican big spenders. So Obama doesn't get public support by supporting climate change. It's almost the reverse. It's been very difficult for him.
Okay. One of the other main arguments that climate deniers make is that the real reason for changes in climate are not about human activity, but rather due to natural causes.
Yeah, there is one theory that has a little bit of traction, and that is that sunspots are changing. Now, it's based mainly on somewhat shaky correlation between the fact that sunspot activity was known to be very low for 200 years, and that's the same 200 years which is known as the Little Ice Age, which ended about 200 years ago. Now, some of these people say, right now, literally this year, sunspot activity is almost at an all-time low, and therefore we're in for another long period of low activity, and that will give us a new ice age. But what is the cause involved? What is the actual mechanism by which high sunspot activity would warm the Earth, or low activity would cool it? What are the mechanisms? No such theory exists. It's purely based on a correlation which itself is a rather weak correlation.
Right. They also say this scientific body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is obviously funded by governments.
Yeah.
And there was a case a few years back where there were 3 governments that didn't like the results of a report by the IPCC and asked them to water down what they said. Isn't that a clear example that this is a body that can be politically manipulated? Don't they have a point?
Yes, but remember that in this case, the scientists were asked to be less definite, to be less strong about their argument that human activity is responsible for. So the political influence in this case was brought about by the carbon industry people. Yeah, they did persuade some governments to complain.
I think one of the final arguments that climate deniers make, and this of course relates to the Paris Agreement, because now countries are going to have to move forward and put in place actions to curb climate change, is that if we move too fast, we could damage entire industries and severely hurt the competitiveness of countries and industries. This could have huge economic shock effects.
Well, that is exactly the argument they're making. And generally speaking, it's the argument they always make against any action on the part of government to ameliorate some environmental consequence. They all claim that it'll be job killers and that whole industries will be badly affected. Generally speaking.
Yes, that's true, but there is a recent example of exactly that.
Yeah.
Look at Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany,
Yeah.
who decided that the country should exit nuclear power, and as a result of that, energy prices, electricity prices have shot up for consumers, and it has real knock-on effects on the competitiveness of German industry. Isn't that an example of what they're talking about?
That would be an example. I don't think I would agree that it was just Angela Merkel who wanted Germany to leave the nuclear business. And in fact, that was a majority of German voters, a fairly strong majority that wants Germany out of the nuclear business. So it wasn't just her. But yes, the price of electricity did rise, and the German economy suffered slightly, not very much. They still have a very large trade surplus. It's by far the strongest economy in Europe. And would it be better for society as a whole to take no action and to let business as usual go on as it is now? But if we are right about the consequence of climate change, and I'm thinking particularly of the sea level rise, I think it's pretty clear that the sea level is going to be somewhere between 60 centimeters and a meter higher by the end of this century. That effect alone will be enormous. The harm, because so many of the important cities of the world are essentially at sea level. So are we to ignore those possibilities? Are we going to take that risk in exchange for not hurting the carbon industry?
So what are the broader consequences of this continued climate denial?
Bad science education. I mean, people are being taught to misunderstand and to distrust science, and to distrust scientists who are supported by government, even though, in fact, most pure science is supported by government and must be supported by government because it's never going to be supported by business. Business isn't in the business of supporting pure science. That's a government responsibility. And I suppose the answer to your question is that whole system of government-supported science, which in the long run has been very successful, very powerful, is being undermined by these climate deniers. I'm not talking about the shills. I'm not talking about the writers and so on. I'm talking about the funders, the Koch brothers, the ExxonMobil people, and so on, people who finance that activity, that anti-science activity.
Bob Ayers, thank you for coming in today to speak with me at INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you.